For a few decades there, at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, politicians across the political spectrum saw reducing the role of government as a top priority. Then came COVID-19, and suddenly the role of government seemed pretty vital once more, and with it, unprecedented spending. With us on the significance of that return to big government, we welcome in L'Orignal in Eastern Ontario, Sean Speer, fellow in residence at the Public Policy Forum. In the nation's capital, Angela McEwen, senior economist with CUPE National. That's the Canadian Union of Public Employees. She's also co-author of the forthcoming book, Share the Wealth, How We Can Tax Canada's Super Rich and Create a Better Country for Everyone. And in Apsley, Ontario, that's in North Kawartha, Tasha Kiernan, a principal at the strategy and public affairs firm Navigator. And it's great to welcome you three back onto our airwaves again here on TVO. I want to start with an excerpt of something Sean wrote a month ago in his new website called The Hub, so here goes. Yesterday's federal budget, along with the Biden administration's activist ambitions in the United States, signals the rise of a new, confident progressivism that has set its sights on the commanding heights of policy and governance. It mostly rejects concerns about the disincentives of high rates of taxation, the economic costs of deficits and debt, or the limits of state action. Instead, it advances a governing vision rooted in the idea that inclusion and equity are not only greater priorities than economic efficiency, but are actually themselves drivers of growth and long-term value. This is a far cry from the limited ambitions of Blairism, Clintonism, or what the Fraser Institute has described as the Chrétien consensus. Okay, Sean, let's get into this, shall we? Was the $650 billion federal budget the death knell of the old low-tax, smaller government approach in Canada?
I think it represents a paradigmatic moment, Steve. The origins of that piece that you referenced will be familiar to you as a journalist. I was sitting at my desk on the night of the budget, thinking what I was going to say. Part of my job is commenting on these types of things, and there was already a flurry of analysis about the size of the deficit, some of the different programs and that were being advanced, and the kind of level of ambition represented in the Trudeau government. And I saw a tweet from a progressive economist named Rob Gillizo at the University of Victoria, in which he described the budget as the culmination of a lengthy process of ideation on the part of progressive thinkers and writers and scholars, and that gave me the basis to write the piece that you referenced, the idea that the budget isn't just a political document, it represents a significant moment in the world of political ideas, and the rise, I think, of a new confident progressivism that is challenging the consensus around economic policy making that has shaped a kind of bipartisan approach in Canada and indeed across the Anglosphere.
Tasha, how about it? Has everybody lost Milton Friedman's phone number these days?
I think to an extent, yes. I will not disagree with Sean that you're seeing a sea change. You're seeing definitely a movement towards greater government at the moment, and it's not surprising. It's not simply the pandemic, but the pandemic, I think, accounts for a lot of it, because in a moment of crisis, the government has been the place where people have been able to turn. I do think, though, this budget here is also an election budget. Let's be realistic. It has something for everyone in it, because we're going to head into an election cycle. And it wouldn't have been this big if we didn't have COVID. The Liberals are big spenders, but not as big as this. That said, I do think that we're at this sort of moment where, yes, people are expecting more from their government. At the same time, I think governments won't be able to deliver that over the longer term, because they will go broke if they try. And we've seen this movie before. If government tries to do everything, it ends up in a situation where it would have to raise taxes to such a rate that the economy would suffer greatly. So I think that this is part of a cycle, but I don't think that it's going to be around forever. And I think there are other alternatives to fill gaps in spending, including the private sector, which I know we're going to get into later in the show.
Indeed, we shall pursue those issues as we go along. Angela, let me though pick up on the pandemic angle here and ask you whether or not you think it took a pandemic for the Liberal government to feel that it had adequate support to be as interventionist in the economy as it has been.
That's a tricky question. So I don't feel that the Trudeau government has been incredibly interventionist in the economy. They've handed out money through CERB directly to people, and that was one of their only options because the tools of the federal government had atrophied to such an extent that they were really only able to get money out to people through the Canada Revenue Agency. The employment insurance system wasn't working because it has been atrophied over decades. And there weren't a lot of other options. They didn't have the levers that they needed in place. Those were gone. And so they've used some shortcuts. They've given more money out to businesses through, say, the wage subsidy. And we've seen how terribly that went because they didn't put any restrictions on it. So companies that were profitable, that were paying out dividends to shareholders, that were taking huge executive salaries, that were actually, firing workers or locking them out and using replacement workers, got this public money. And so I wouldn't say it's been an incredibly interventionist government in the way that I would like it to be, or the way that Sean is talking about the progressive movement would like it to be.
All right, understand. Let me do a follow-up with you then and put it this way. What are the problems that you think government and only government can solve in 2021 that you think no other sector in society can?
Absolutely. So I think the care economy is a big piece of that. And so that is something that we saw in the budget. We saw a move towards actually implementing a national childcare system. There should be no profit motive in care. We saw that in long-term care, that the profit motive resulted in more deaths, that it results in worse working conditions for workers, which absolutely then ends up in worse conditions for the people who are being cared for. So in terms of long-term care, in terms of even just testing people for the virus or rolling out the vaccine or developing the vaccine, I think we would have been much farther ahead if we still had the public institutions like pharmaceutical research that we had in the 80s that Brian Mulroney privatized. If we had public long-term care, like most of the long-term care homes in Saskatchewan where I grew up were long-term care, and they've been privatized and they've been focusing on building this sort of private model that really doesn't work to deliver care. And so if we want to have an economy that is strong, that is prosperous, that we take care of each other, I think the government has to really focus on infrastructure like broadband internet. We've seen this where that's absolutely critical to participate in this economy. And they've delivered that through privatizing again. They've delivered subsidies to private companies that then charge huge bills to private citizens. And so that excludes people from the economy. That excludes people from being able to participate in the economy in a way that is not healthy for any of us. And so those two pieces, care and key infrastructure.
Understood. Sean, if we think the numbers are big here, let's look stateside, because the Biden administration is spending not hundreds of billions as we are here, but trillions to bring the economy back from COVID-19. And I wonder, to the extent that anything is permanent in this world, do you think this is ushering in a new era of, semi-permanent big spending?
Yeah, that's the risk. As Milton Friedman famously said, there's nothing permanent, nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. But if I can just step back for a second, Tasha talked about the kind of secular nature of the world of political ideas. We saw, for instance, the rise of Reagan and Thatcher in the late 70s and early 80s in response to a series of significant challenges facing advanced economies. We had stagnation, sclerosis, and drift, captured most poignantly by Jimmy Carter's crisis of confidence speech. And so they ushered in an era of market reforms to unshackle the economy. And that produced a whole host of benefits in the form of lifting billions of people out of poverty around the world, ushering in the computer revolution, and so on. But I think what we've seen over the past decade or so is diminished returns in terms of the kind of implementation of policies influenced and shaped by those ideas. And I think the global financial crisis, in a lot of ways, Steve, was an inflection point. It might have represented, in hindsight, a kind of expiry date for what is sometimes referred to as a neoliberal consensus or the Washington consensus, or however one might describe it. And I think what we've only seen more and more, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, is the emergence of alternative ways of thinking.
Tasha, as you look south, what concerns you?
I'm concerned more about the social stability or instability in the United States. I think that both my fellow panelists mentioned inequality. Inequality is a big issue now across the board. It is up there with the environment. There's a sort of a sense of consciousness or awakening following the death of George Floyd, following the Black Lives Matter movement, but also I think the sense that's coming out of the financial crisis, as Sean mentioned. That was a sort of the economic inequality piece, and now you're seeing the social inequality piece. And I think the United States in particular has to grapple with its historical legacy on slavery in a way that most other nations do not, but other nations also still have high levels of inequality and discrimination. So that's what concerns me most south of the border. I think the spending piece, of course, the runaway train on spending, we're seeing it, like you said, around the world. I don't think that is sustainable. I do think, though, that inequality is something that will be a driving force politically. And that is where government does have a different role in the sense that, yes, it tries to level the playing field. But I think ultimately the playing field will be leveled more by the private sector, by corporations, than by government. They are the employers of record. They are the people who are responding to consumers. They are seeing increasing demands by both their workforce and customers and the general public to step up on issues, for example, of inequality, and also to pay fairer wages. We saw that during the pandemic, pay a premium to essential workers. Companies that did those sorts of things did very well in the public eye, and they realized also that it also improves shareholder returns. So I think, to go back to the question of what's going to motivate people to change, yes, government can use the stick and say we're going to force people to change. I think ultimately public pressure and these waves, this movement, as Sean said, the wave that's coming now is going to make change happen where it will perhaps be more lasting, and that is in the private sector and with different types of behavior from companies.
Angela, I got a feeling you want to take that on.
Right. So I think the role of government here is actually to make the rules fair. And what has happened over the past few decades is the system has become rigged because the people who have power are these super large corporations. So we saw Amazon, for example, who isn't paying its workers a bonus, who didn't even give workers sick leave, who had huge outbreaks in their warehouses, and the government had to step in and shut it down. And it was actually like the local health district that had to come in and shut it down in Peel because the provincial government wasn't willing to take action. And it was racialized workers mostly who were at risk. So I would say that the people who have been most targeted by the negative inequality impacts of this recession don't have the power in the system right now. And the rules aren't fair. That's why when we have the wage subsidy paid out to people that paid dividends, because the government didn't make the rules of the game fair. And that is a key problem. And it's too technical and it's too easy to spin for there to actually develop a sustained public pressure to change the system. We tend to see historically these waves. Inequality has to get pretty bad for there to be this public pressure to shift and to force government to step in and play its role as defender of citizens instead of as defender of profit for corporations.
Sean, I'm not sure whose dog we're hearing in the background, but all pets like to make cameos during this program, we've discovered over the last year and a half. The dog sounds in misery, which sounds like a good time to raise the issue of the misery index. For those who are young and may not remember, we do remember, you referenced it a moment ago, the economic difficulties during the time of Jimmy Carter, and then Ronald Reagan, George Bush, the father, coming into power after that. And the thing called the misery index, which was something that was very helpful to Ronald Reagan's campaign. We actually have a chart with this. Do you want to walk us through this and explain what the misery index is and what this chart shows?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I referenced earlier that the rise of the kind of market-oriented consensus of the late 70s, can find its origins in this chart. There was a sense by the end of the 70s that the mixed economy model, which envisioned the kind of role for government in shaping market outcomes that Angela's referring to, had kind of reached its end. And the fact that the American economy was marked by a combination of high unemployment and high inflation, which were represented in this misery index that spiked to unprecedented rates in the late 70s, was a sign that new ideas, new approaches needed to take shape, and that ultimately, as you said, Steve, became a major part of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher's value proposition. And
let me just ask Tony. Forgive me for a sec, Sean. I'm going to ask Tony to bring the chart up again, because the misery index was basically take the inflation rate, take the unemployment rate, add them together. Obviously, you'd love that line to be right near the bottom, right? Low unemployment, low inflation, and you can see the spikes on this chart here. Particularly around 1980, when the misery index was extremely high and ushered in Reaganomics. Anyway, sorry to interrupt there, Sean, but I wanted people to understand what that chart was saying. Take it away.
So I guess there's a bit of a lesson there, Steve. Angela has described a kind of heightened ambition for the role of government going forward. And I think, if progressives are prepared to take some advice from a conservative, I would say, you need to be careful. The risk of overreach, which we saw in the late 70s, precipitated the kind of course correction represented by Reagan and Thatcher. And so, on one hand, while I'm anxious about some of these intellectual and policy developments, I remain kind of reasonably confident that overreach will necessitate the type of adjustments that I suspect Tasha and I would be more predisposed to. But let me just make one final point. In that regard, there's an onus on conservatives to develop an agenda that is responsive to the issues and challenges facing Canada in 2021. One of the reasons why this market-oriented consensus ultimately, lost its salience was because it seemed like it became dogmatic. That is to say, it continued to advance the same ideas, same policies, even though the circumstances and conditions were different than the ones in which it was initially conceived. And I think in some ways the onus is on conservatives here. They became too persuaded by the end of history narrative and lost their connection to the issues and challenges facing ordinary people. And the consequence is the growing resonance of progressive ideas.
Let me ask Angela if she's prepared to accept your advice about overreach and the admonitions that come along with that. What about it, Angela?
So what I'm more worried about is actually co-opting of some of our ideas, and that because what we're looking for isn't just higher taxes and more government spending. There are different choices that we want to make. We want to invest differently than we did before. And so some of that might seem familiar. A national transit. So I want a crown corporation that will affordably help people get across this giant country that we have. It seems ridiculous that you can't get from A to B without a car in lots of places in Canada, right? So, and with Greyhound going bankrupt, we know that that's not profitable. So there are things that the public needs that aren't exactly public goods the way economists think of them, but are good for the public. And that I think there is a government role in doing that. But that doesn't mean that I think the government should take over every private role. I think that we really have to have a good conversation about the role between government and the private sector and the way that government can enhance what the private sector does. All businesses would benefit if we had, for example, affordable telecommunications infrastructure in Canada, rather than a system where we give handouts to specific businesses that know how to use the government grant system. I don't think that's an indication of success in the economy. I think that what we want to do is provide that foundation for all businesses and people to succeed. I think we want to make the rules.
Oh, I think we lost Angela. That this is one of the it's ironic. She's talking about broadband and telecommunication services, and
Yeah,
bingo, there we
curse
go.
of our life.
We will get her hooked back into this in a second. But Tasha, you mentioned something a moment ago that I wanted to follow up on, and that was the sustainability of the current amount of funding that governments in the West, well, all over the world, seem prepared to do right now. And I want to flip that around and ask you the other side of that coin, which is, by the I don't know, I guess by the middle 2000s, 2000 teens, whatever those are called. I guess by the time Dalton McGuinty and Stephen Harper had left office, the push to lower corporate income taxes in the hopes that they would use that added revenue to hire people really had become religion for many on the right. And I wonder whether, given the demands on the public purse today for additional spending for a lot of the things that we just heard Angela talking about, do you think the low levels of corporate tax rates in this country, do you think that was sustainable as well?
I think the short answer is I think yes, and I'll tell you why. I don't think that high rates of corporate taxation are going to yield longer revenues for the government in the long term. It's very clear when you look at historical levels of taxation, you reach a tipping point on the curve where it actually brings in less government revenue, in part because companies will also move the seats. Now they have greater mobility. They'll move the seats of their corporations elsewhere. They will find ways of not paying those high taxes. They'll get out of your jurisdiction. They won't set up a plant there, or they'll simply have their head office somewhere else. So you're dealing in an era right now, and you have great mobility for corporations and corporate money. You also, though, interestingly, what the pandemic has shown us is that you also have a greater now ability of individuals to have this mobility to work from anywhere. As you said, I'm sitting here in my kitchen in Apsley in North Kawartha. I can work from here. I am lucky I can do that, but I'm not alone. I mean, a lot of people can work from different places. This is also going to change the relationship on a lot of levels of government to individuals and to corporations. Corporations are going to have to make a greater incentive to keep workers, because workers now don't have to move for their job. They could move from their home. They can stay where they are and take another job much more easily than they could in the past. Also, governments, though, are going to be, I think, having to reprioritize. I disagree. We need a national transit strategy. I think that it's great that many people are no longer taking transit or the car to work. That is something that maybe a benefit that comes out of this if work from home becomes a greater reality for more people. There are communities in Ontario that have used, for example, small-scale transit services based on the Uber model that are much more efficient, much less costly to the public purse than some giant, usual, we think of have a bus route that runs 24 hours. It doesn't make sense. We have to think outside the box. So if government just goes in and says, yes, let's splash out on a national transit study because we think people should get from A to B without a car. Well, not all of Canada is like that. You're never going to have transit in North Kawartha, for example, from where I'm sitting to other places that runs on the schedule that you would see in an urban center. We have to be more diverse in our approaches. So I'm hoping that this spending that is happening while it goes on, which frankly it can't go on forever, that it is actually deployed to places that make sense, that make change that actually will be beneficial, that takes into account the realities that we now have. This is not the model of even 2000 or 2010.
Steve, one of the areas where I do think there needs to be adjustments or corrections to the market-oriented consensus that predated the pandemic is in the area of domestic productive capacities. One of the consequences of the emphasis on globalization and letting markets determine where things were made and who made them, I think, is we've discovered in the context of the pandemic that there are a number of kind of critical productive capacities that we don't have in our jurisdiction, and many countries like us have discovered the same thing. I do think one of the outcomes of the pandemic that ought to be the subject of a kind of left-right consensus is the need to rethink the role of government in ensuring that there are certain kind of strategic capacities that we need to have within our borders. And I think, we'll see a move towards reshoring. And I don't think conservatives who are generally suspicious of government intervention should oppose those steps. I think, we want to make sure in the next emergency we have the capacities we need. There will be an example of a more interventionist government that I would support.
I notice now Angela is back, and Angela, there is something deeply ironic about your trying to make a point about the unequal application of broadband across the country at the moment that your line crashes. But anyway, we're glad to have you back, and I want to, just in our remaining moments here, I want to get us onto a bit of a conversation about, we're borrowing massive amounts of money right now. I know, Angela, you believe that it is sustainable, that it is not, the government is not taking too big a part of the economic activity of this country. But we are borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars right now to do what we're doing. And I guess the question is, how do you think we are going to pay that back someday?
Well, thank you very much, Steve. So I do think that we can borrow money. If you look at government spending, we often think about the deficit, but we don't always factor in the benefit of that spending. And so as long as the benefit of what we're spending on has a higher rate of return than the cost of carrying that debt, we're okay. You could run deficits forever. My husband doesn't believe me, people. This is what I do. But mathematically, it works. But that's what we're doing right now. We have huge billions of dollars of deficit. You cannot do that indefinitely, I don't think. I think that the international market at some point punishes you and no longer offers you debt. And we are right now mostly borrowing from ourselves, where most of the debt is in Canadian dollars. So as long as Canadians are willing to lend to the government, we're okay. But I do think in the medium term, in the longer term, we need to tax people more. And we have cut taxes by between $50 to $75 billion at the federal government level just since 2000. And so this has been part of Jean Chrétien's government, Paul Martin, Stephen Harper, and Justin Trudeau has mostly not cut taxes. He's raised some a little, he's cut some a little. But the middle class tax cut that really only went to the top 10% of income earners is $6 billion that revenue. The way we tax gains cuts about $20 billion out of revenue. The corporate income tax rate fell from 30% to 15% now. And globally, we've seen that orthodoxy that Sean's talking about, cutting corporate taxes no longer conveys any economic benefit. All it does is increase actually inequality. It increases the money going to the top 1%. That's what research has shown us. And so my colleague and I, who really think that we need to kind of rebalance things, that this pendulum has gone way too far, we need to increase government revenue. We wrote the book called Share the Wealth, where we list several key ways that we can increase taxes.
Oh dear, here we go again.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, Tashi, you looked like you were champing at the bit to get in there anyway, so
a
go
little
ahead.
bit. I was going to say, yes, and we also have, I don't disagree that there have been tax cuts, but I also would like to point out we have, prior to the pandemic anyway, as a result of this, historically low levels of unemployment in this country. We have historically low levels of inflation, and it's fine to say you can rack up debt as long as you also have historically low interest rates. That's one of the reasons that individuals as well have been borrowing as much as they have. You jack those up and you get back to the situation in the 1980s when you did have 18% interest rates. It was not uncommon to have that on a mortgage, and people were not able to buy a home. People complain today they can't buy a home. Well, good luck with that. Argentina comes to mind, a country that racks up debt endlessly. That's what you get. Newfoundland right now is facing a debt and spending crisis within our own borders. It's fine to say, well, we'll tax people more. You can't simply say we will tax corporations, tax individuals. The money will not necessarily stay in your country. You will also unbalance a system whereby if you do increase taxes, you shouldn't be doing it on income. This is the other fallacy, is that we've decreased income taxes and somehow that's deprived the government of revenue. Well, the GST or HST in some provinces is ticking along very well. No one's getting rid of that because it is bringing in billions of dollars over time since it was brought in. That it was not necessarily anticipated to do. That's the cash cow for this government. So there are lots of taxes flowing to the government. The problem is, as Sean said, the more you give them or the more programs you start, the more taxes you need to feed them, and they will not go away. So you have to be very judicious about any new programs that you do start, which is why in particular this budget to me is upsetting or disturbing, because it is spending more on new programs at a time when we are in a crisis situation, borrowing just to keep the economy afloat. So I think we have to be very careful about overextending ourselves, because other countries in history has shown us that can really prove to be disastrous.
Tasha, I'm going to give you the last 30 seconds in our program here today for a couple of reasons. Number one, I want to know your answer to the question. Number two, both of our other two guests have disappeared because of broadband problems. So in any event, let's just finish up on this. You know, we famously remember Prime Minister Trudeau saying that we can essentially grow our way out of deficits. And I know he was ridiculed for saying that. But there is a school of thought that says if the government invests in things that are smart, and not just throwing money away willy-nilly, but actually invests in things that are smart and can grow the economy to the point where the money we owe is a smaller percentage of our gross domestic product, we can get there, can we not? I mean, would you grant that there is some credibility in that?
That's assuming their investments are wisely made. So this is
Right.
the issue. Market investments made by companies, they will expect a return. They will not invest in something unless they believe they will get that return, and they can basically show their shareholders, yes, you should invest in this. Government is voted in by voters, and it makes its priorities on basis on politics too. I mean, I'm from Quebec originally, and the joke there was in the time of Maurice Duplessis. You know, you voted Union Nationale, you had a road in your riding. This kind of thing, these decisions, it's fine to say, let's build roads, let's build transit, let's build these things. But if you're not making them for, just as you point out, economic decisions or economic reasons, then you're not going to get the bang for your buck. You're going to get also people applying for all those grant programs that were mentioned earlier. If you create grant programs, preferential treatment to some, not to others. So again, the less you're outlaying to begin with, the less risk of that. I think certain things like broadband, yes, I will say, I think broadband should be extended because it will give people the options and more choices of where they live. And it will improve not just the ability of your guests to enter into this program, Steve, and participate, but it will also improve our connectivity, which will help lift people out of poverty in remote communities. So I think that is as an investment, I would actually agree with our other guests, should be made.
I'm all for increased connectivity, particularly during current affairs programs where it seems to be an issue. But actually, I think we have everybody lined up just long enough to say Sean Speer from the Public Policy Forum, Angela McEwen from CUPE National, Tasha Kiridan from Navigator. Thanks everybody for being here for most of our conversation. We've enjoyed it very much. Take care, everybody.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.